We're going to talk about mental health today. I put Games for Good. That is the name of an actual event, which I'm going to talk about at the end a little bit. I'm not a representative for that event, but it's just a very catchy thing to say. But yeah, a little bit about me. I am Dr. Anne Marie Porter. I have a degree in health psychology, so that's what I studied all throughout graduate school. And I did my dissertation research on video games and stress. And actually, we're going to mention that study a little bit in this presentation. And I'm also, as of last year, I'm signed on with Deepwell, which is a new indie game company that just launched last March. And our goal is to try to make games that have elements that could help with the mental health crisis that's going on. And so I serve as one of their leads on their science and medical team, and I do consulting. And so this is kind of a summary of the work that I've done for them for the past year, looking up what games help mental health, what are the mechanics at work that are really helping, so we can guide them and other developers and say, hey, here's the direction you should go if you want to make a game, and to guide people in general, like if you're struggling with anxiety and depression and stress, here are some games you can play that can, help with that a little bit. So that's kind of my goal of this presentation today. So, is anybody surprised that there's a current mental health crisis? No. So according to the National Institute of Mental Health, this is back in 2020, over 52 million adults live with a mental illness, and that number's probably higher just 2 years later, which is unfortunate. And what's kind of interesting is, although the pandemic's a big part of it, we actually saw these rates increasing even before the pandemic. So there are clearly factors at work outside of the pandemic that are affecting these mental illness rates. So we found, like, in the decade from 2009 to 2017, depression in young adults increased by like 63%. It was like quite a big jump. And as professionals, we're still teasing apart what's going on there. And then, I don't think anybody's surprised, but during the pandemic, anxiety and depression got even worse. I mean, is anybody surprised by that either? And one thing we're seeing, this is statistics from one of the articles published by APA. The rates are still remaining high. I haven't checked as of right now. Maybe they've decreased a little bit, but it doesn't seem to be going that way. So you could see back in 2019, before the pandemic hit, about 7 to 8% of adults reported having anxiety symptoms, and now it's like 28 to 37%. I mean, that's a huge jump. And same thing with depression as well. So there's a problem. That's why we're looking for solutions anywhere we can find it. And one of the main reasons for that, too, is I have friends that are therapists, and they're just completely overwhelmed. Our mental health system really wasn't built for this percentage increase. So that's why being creative and looking for other solutions is really great. So mental health is really complicated. This is called the biopsychosocial model of mental health. This is what I was trained with as a health psychologist. And so there used to be an idea in earlier decades that there was this mind-body dichotomy, like the mind and the body were separate entities in a body, and they had different needs and different treatments. But now we do a more holistic approach, and that's what this shows, is that when you're dealing with a problem like mental health, it's everything. It's everything and anything. So it's biological, it's predisposed genetics, it's certain diseases, inflammation, hormones, diet and exercise. All of these things can play a factor in your anxiety, depression, as well as psychological elements like your emotions and your beliefs and attitudes, your coping skills, and as well as your social and environmental factors. So the way you were brought up, your family, your friends, your peers, social media, like the overall culture, stress at work, all these things play a role all at the same time. And so when we're looking at solutions, we can't just like look at one thing in particular. It all kind of goes together. Now, where can video games help? they can help with these two things. Hooray! You're going to see this when I do the presentation, get into the details. Mostly I see video games helping with the psychological part of things. So the coping skills, emotion management, attitudes and beliefs, and a little bit with the social stuff too, because obviously you can play with your friends, you can have those healthy social experiences, and so it can help a little bit there as well. But mainly I'm seeing it on the psychological bubble that video games are targeting in their interventions. Okay, so I'm going to address 3 areas. There's a lot more areas that video games can do, but I'm going to look at anxiety, depression, and trauma today. Those are like the big 3, and those are the biggest increases that we've seen, especially lately. So with anxiety and stress, this is where video games are the strongest in terms of the evidence for helping. There's a lot of evidence. This is like a presentation from a review that was published just last year, and I was really happy for the most part with how the review focused on things. So they reviewed 28 different peer-reviewed published studies. They used commercial games, and these are like off-the-shelf games you could just buy in a store. And the reason we have to distinguish that is a lot of studies will make their own games that are not available commercially. So they'll have like an internal team and they'll design a game specifically to treat something, but then nobody can buy it. And that's kind of a big challenge there. So this review is looking at commercial games that you can get right now if you want. And the good news, not only do all these studies show that games can help stress and anxiety, but they can help a wide range of individuals. So we see these games helping children, young adults, and even older adults, like above the age of 65, with stress and anxiety. And games can help healthy individuals, like for the most part, or individuals with milder anxiety, but they can also help individuals with more severe depression, anxiety, PTSD, disabilities, diseases like Parkinson's disease, or going through medical procedures like burn wound debridement is what it's called. And I can talk a little bit about that if people have questions later, because I actually worked on that study, the burn wound debridement study. That was my very first video game study that I ever worked on as an undergrad. So it was kind of cool to see it in this review. I was like, oh, wow. I remember being in the lab doing that stuff. But that was done actually just up at UMBC by a professor called Dr. Lynn Dahlquist. And so she was showing that children that were undergoing painful medical procedures, whether it's changing burn wounds, whether it's chemotherapy, they can play video games at the same time and make something that's an awful experience a less awful experience by at least having something to focus on and something to do other than just sit there. So that was a really cool little thing that I appreciate them putting in the review. So I'll ask the audience here, what types of games do you think decrease stress and anxiety? Any guesses? Animal Crossing?
There's a particular game that comes to mind, Celeste.
Celeste, okay.
The character experiences a lot of the same struggles, and through the course of the game, what you're doing with the character helps them overcome those struggles in more in a metaphorical way, but still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Celeste is a good one.
Games of storytelling.
What was that?
Games of storytelling.
Games of storytelling, especially around mental health. Purple shirt in the back.
I read that stuff like just like Tetris for short-term stuff because it's just
Tetris.
and doesn't take a lot of brain or a certain type of brain, different type of brain.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on the person. Obviously, everyone's different. Some people feel that if they resonate with a game that has experienced a more serious example of trauma and PTSD. Some people resonate with that and feel that they are listened to by the game and they're able to play through off of experience
Yeah.
and feel that empathy. Versus people who are more casual and just very mindless, just like I am talking about someone else. We're starting out.
Okay. So are you saying that the more casual games would be helpful, or the games where you more explore the emotional empathy would be
I think that comes down to the person.
the individual person, yeah.
It's kind of hard to say what would help.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
For a lot of people, sandbox games where they
Yeah.
can just make the world whatever they want it, it gives them a sense of control, a sense of freedom, some way that they can project whatever's in their head onto the world and make something good out of it.
Oh yeah, like Minecraft for sure. Yeah.
Skyrim.
I actually did use Skyrim in one of my studies to test emotions, so I have done it. I think it depends where you are in Skyrim. For me, in particular, the spider caves are very, I'm very anxious in them. But there are other areas that are really nice.
Stardew Valley.
Stardew Valley, yeah, absolutely. All the way in the back.
Shooter and fighting game.
Oh, maybe. I'll show you the data on that.
Catharsis probably.
Yeah, there's the catharsis theory with shooting and fighting games for sure.
For me, at least, rhythm games.
Rhythm games? Oh, yeah, that's my go-to. I love rhythm games.
Music and
I know, I have such a rhythm game addiction.
Puzzle games, as long as they don't suck.
Puzzle games that don't suck. What's an example of one that sucks?
There are some that are not made very well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we'll get into that, how, like, games have to be made well and be engaging to work at all. Like, none of this matters if the game doesn't work. All right, so I'll show the results here. So these are only 28 studies, so obviously they can only test 28 games. So we're not going to see like a lot of games here, but you can get a sense of like the kind of genres. So actually, AR games like Pokemon Go have been tested with Japanese employees over in Japan. That was really cool. They showed how that decreased stress because there's an exercise element. There's like a social element too, that you're playing with other people. Puzzle games, so like Tetris and Bejeweled have been tested, things like that. Casual games, I feel like there's like a new genre kind of name for that, but for some reason Plants vs. Zombies is really popular in some of these studies to test, and it seems to be very, very helpful. So children's action games, so like Lego Marvel and Ice Age 2 have been tested. And then Exer games, so like Wii Sports and Wii Fit have been tested. And all of these have shown to reduce stress and anxiety. Some of this is self-reported emotion scale, so like I feel less anxious and stressed, but some of this is also physiological, so they actually show decreases in heart rate, increases of what we call heart rate variability. Heart rate variability, the higher it is, the better it is. That means you're more relaxed. So they also looked at, physiological variables, I know, in these things as well. So games that have mixed or negative results, this is where we get into the shooting and action games, and this is what I'll call the mixed results. So there was one study that looked at sports games, FIFA 2013. They said this increased stress. Now sometimes they mean like not emotion scales, but they mean like an increased heart rate or blood pressure, because stress has like multiple elements. There's like an emotion element, but there's also like a physiological element. Shooting games like Call of Duty and Counter-Strike, they saw it did increase heart rate and stress, but still people reported positive emotions in playing it. So people didn't feel more anxious, but you did still see the body react differently than any of those previous games, like very differently than like AR games or puzzle games or casual games, things like that. Same thing with fighting games, where we saw an increase in blood pressure. This is like temporary, so it increases just while you're playing and then it goes back to normal. And but we still see it shows positive emotions. And I'm sorry, Mortal Kombat players, this study was my study, so this just happened to be what I found. Like I was there, and I was surprised too. But we didn't see this increase in blood pressure when people were playing Tetris, even though I had them play on like the hardest difficulty. We just like didn't see that change. So it is really interesting how in both cases people are just sitting in a chair. One person's playing Mortal Kombat, one person's playing Tetris. I had them both play on like super hard difficulty, and yet only Mortal Kombat increased blood pressure. So there like is something different there. And then MMORPGs like World of Warcraft, they found it depended on the person sometimes. There are some people that found it more relaxing, but there were some people that were like, this is too stressful for me. So these are like, not bad games, these are like maybe games, I guess when it comes to that. And then horror and action games like Left 4 Dead and Killing Floor, they found increased stress. If you ever read this review, that's like the only criticism I had of this review. They said these games decrease stress in the review, which I read the original articles and that was not accurate. They said that they had veterans and soldiers play these games in order to create stress for training purposes, and they found these games successfully stress them out like a training scenario would. It's just it stressed them out less than a typical military training scenario. So it's like, well, it still stressed them out. That was the point. So the recommendations here, definitely play these games for fun with your friends, like absolutely. Like I play these kind of games all the time. It shouldn't be like harmful, like in terms of like your body's heart rate and blood pressure will go back to normal. But like if you're suffering from stress and anxiety in particular, and you really are dealing with that and you're struggling with that and you want to feel better in the moment, then I would not play these games in the moment if your goal is to decrease stress and anxiety, maybe. But still, like, absolutely do it for having fun. And there can be a lot of other benefits, you know, in just playing with your friends, in doing other things. So I'm not telling anybody not to play these games. I'm just saying, be aware of how it affects your stress and anxiety if that's something you're already dealing with. And you had a comment about the Mortal Kombat study earlier?
Yeah, I mean, it does kind of make sense about the increased blood pressure because, I mean, you're literally being put in a situation of combat, fight or flight.
Yeah, it's a combat situation, virtually.
Yeah, adrenaline pumping.
Yeah, for sure. Yes?
Are there any difficulties in figuring out mental state? Because from what I understand, for the positive or negative, the physiological factors look the same when you take the measurements. So do they have positive emotions associated with it? Is it at all, do you only have the self-reported data for that? Or are people getting better if you can kind of suss that out?
Okay, he was asking about measurement in terms of like self-report and how you can distinguish, especially when heart rate can increase when you're having good positive, like your heart rate can increase in good situations where you're excited as well as stressful situations. So I think the key here is the blood pressure. So I actually use what's called the biopsychosocial model of challenge and threat. That's kind of a mouthful. And so especially if you're doing like sedentary activities, if you see an increase in blood pressure, that suggests it's a more stressful situation for your body versus if you don't see an increase in blood pressure, it's a less stressful situation for your body. So there is a difference in like the blood pressure they theorized. So if you were having like a really excited, like happy kind of moment with your body, then you shouldn't see the increase in blood pressure. If you're just sitting there in like a sedentary activity. Of course, it's different if you're like running around or exercising. That's a little bit different. So I think that's the key there, according to that theory. Black jacket.
So I was just wondering if there was any recording of how long it took people to return to like the phase once they were put or had whatever stressful reaction. Like, how they looked at what that was in terms of prolonged state in the moment.
Yeah, so they're asking about how long does it take to return to baseline in terms of heart rate and blood pressure. Actually, people have looked at that. In fact, there was one video game study that looked at that I referred to in my work. Heart rate, it is very quick. Within 5 minutes, you return to baseline. The heart responds very quickly. Blood pressure, it takes probably about 10 to 15 minutes to return to like baseline, which is still pretty fast. And that's why one of my theories is when you talk about, when you hear recommendations for guided meditation or breathing exercises, they usually say a minimum of 15 minutes. And I'm guessing that's why. Because it takes like 10 to 15 minutes for your blood pressure, for your body to really like be completely at rest. So that's why I think they suggest at least 15 minutes, is my guess.
For these studies, were all the games just played individually on their own, or was more of like multiplayer?
Oh, good question. They're asking if it was individual gamers or multiplayer. Sometimes it was individual. Like for my Mortal Kombat study, it was individual. When they do puzzle games, it's individual. When they do Plants and Zombies, it's individual. Sometimes it was multiplayer. So like with the Lego Marvel Heroes game, that was multiplayer. World of Warcraft was multiplayer. And the horror and action games, I believe, was also multiplayer because they wanted to do like a training scenario. So it's kind of a mix. Purple shirt.
When they do these studies, are these people already familiar with these games? They're not trying to learn these games on the fly, right?
We do in these studies have control variables where we ask them how familiar they are with video games, if they've ever played, do they know these games. When we usually recruit for these studies, we don't tell them what game they're going to be playing, so we don't get that selection bias. I do when they arrive in the lab. I don't in the recruitment. I just say they're going to be playing some games. Because if I said like, you know, you'll be playing Tetris and Mortal Kombat, you're going to get people that really like Tetris and Mortal Kombat. And so I try not to advertise that too much. It's a pretty big range. I have gotten people that are like majorly good gamers. In fact, there is this one girl who is like the best Tetris player I've ever seen. Like I had her play on the hardest difficulty and she just like didn't faze her a bit. And then I also got people that never touched a video game before in their life, believe it or not. In the middle there, yeah.
Back to the multiplayer question, were these all in cooperative situations or were there any competitive player versus player sort of situations?
Cooperative in these cases, yeah, which I think is a big difference. Yeah. You had a question? Yeah.
Bouncing off of his question about this is cooperative, what the strategies for multiplayer, were they similar? Like, did they have similar stress level or anxiety? Or was one able to handle it better than the other? That's kind of complex.
Yeah, they're asking if in the cooperative games, if they looked at the pair individually. That's what you're asking, right? If they compared the stress levels of each person that was playing together.
Did one affect the other, or were they both equally like stressed out?
Well, in this case, they were less stressed out. Their stress decreased in terms of like the Lego Marvel Heroes game. That was definitely multiplayer. So their stress level decreased. I believe they looked at them together because of the way they were comparing the two groups. So they had a cooperative group and a competitive group. So I think they actually compared co-op versus competitive, and they saw the co-op had decreased stress together. So I know they looked at each person individually. I don't think they compared them just in that particular study. So I don't think they could answer that.
So you talked about how long it takes your physiological systems to come back down from any increased stress or activity during the games. Were there any of these studies that looked at how playing the game affected stress levels over the course of the rest of a day or longer time periods?
Yeah, that's a good question. If studies have looked at games over longer time periods. We're going to get into some studies actually right now that do 4-week interventions. So they look at like multiple sessions of gameplay, like over 4 weeks. So yeah, they have looked at that a little bit. So I'm excited to get into that. Because I wanted to show like an overview, but then also like just 1 or 2 studies that were kind of really cool examples of each of these topics. So with games and anxieties, this is one of my favorites. 54 participants with clinical depression and anxiety, and they were already identified as under-responding to SSRI medication. 30 of them played Plants vs. Zombies for 4 weeks, and they still stayed on their SSRI medication. The other 24 didn't play any video games for those 4 weeks. They were actually recommended not to. And they took a second medication that was supposed to be a little extra helpful along with their SSRI. And they played Plants vs. Zombies for 30 to 45 minutes, about 4 times a week. So this is more like a randomized control trial approach. And what's kind of cool is those playing the game had lower anxiety symptoms after a month than those only taking medication, which is like a really super cool finding. Now, it does show that you should still take the medication, like they're still taking SSRIs in both groups, but it shows that there are limitations to medication and the games are providing an extra benefit beyond that. I'll just go through the next slide and then And then another really cool game that looked at anxiety was one called Mindlight, and this is a game that is not commercially available. This was made by a group of researchers specifically to treat anxiety. And they tested this with 43 children that they knew had clinical anxiety. They played for 1 hour a week for 6 weeks. What's kind of cool is they incorporated cognitive behavioral therapy elements in the design. And they actually attached EEG sensors that responded to them within the game. So as the EEG sensed they were more relaxed or less stressed, they had actually more physical light available to them with a flashlight, like in the game. And they used the flashlight to do exposure training. So they would have these kind of like fearful things in the dark, and you would have to approach those fearful things and shine this light on them in order to kind of deal with that fear and anxiety. And so the whole point of the game was to teach the children to deal with the fear, to face the fear, and attend to like the positive aspects of what's going on rather than the negative. And it depended how children responded in the game. So if children were more engaged with the game and they exposed themselves to more fear events, so they actually approached these more fearful things, they had lower anxiety 3 months later, even after the 6 weeks, which is pretty cool. But they found if the children spent more time hiding and they didn't face any of the fear events, they had higher anxiety 3 months later. So that was like a really interesting study of like, it's important when you make these games to monitor what the players are doing in them. Any other thoughts on that section before we get to the depression part? Yes, in front.
For the one where we tested SSRI plus second medication,
yes.
SSRI video game, do you know how long the body is trying to acclimate to drugs for mental health? So since we only tested what's kind of a month, did you take that into account when they started taking second medication, or could that also be the results now?
Oh, okay. That's a good point. Yeah, they were making a point that sometimes it could take the body a while to get acclimated to a new medications. That could be a potential limitation in the study. Although I have heard from a psychiatrist, because the psychiatrist prescribes medication. I heard like they expect to see results within after 2 weeks usually, and I mean they studied this for I think 4 weeks. So I would expect with even 4 weeks they would see some change with that new medication by then, even if they haven't fully acclimated to it. Yes?
When you're establishing who's going to be in control and all that kind of stuff, you said, for example, one of the groups, they were not supposed to play any video games. Like, I would find that more stressful. Like, if, I don't know, it'd be like when people come and they had to stop smoking, and then you compare it to the smoking group, and you're like, look, the smoking group was less stressed out.
Yeah.
So how do you control for habits and stuff like that? Like, if someone's already gaming a lot, and you told them to stop gaming, that seems like it might skew your results.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, that'd be definitely a potential confound to look at. So if they're used to playing these games regularly, to relieve their stress and they stop, they might get more stressed out. In that case, I think the researchers still made the right call, because if they like to play these relaxing games just on a day-to-day basis, they wouldn't see any results in the study, right? Like that would kind of mess everything up. What I would do is I would kind of ask them what games they play and how often they play them usually, and then I'll see if the results of those people are different than the results of the people that never play games usually. So that's what I would do to see if that had an effect, you know.
So what's your end value? Like how many people are in these studies?
For these 4-week-long studies, usually like around 50 to 60, because you're doing multiple measurements over like 4 weeks with the same people, so you don't need as high an N, because you're controlling for within-person factors. But if you're doing just a single time study, I usually try to get like 200 people and like 100 per group. But when you're doing these long-term studies with the same people, you don't need as many. Okay. So on to depression. Like all these are like depressing topics. So when it comes to games and depression, there is evidence, but there's less evidence than for stress and anxiety. That seems to be just like the biggest factor that games seem to help with. But there was a review of 12 studies that looked at games and depression. So it's there, it's just not quite as strong. And we see a lot of similarities here. So there are some games like that have been developed specifically to treat depression. One is called Sparks, and I'll get into that in the next slide. Once again, Plants vs. Zombies, kind of casual games seem to help. And extra games seem to play a big role in helping with depression. And that makes a lot of sense, because we hear, you know, how the hormones that are released during exercise can play a big role in reducing the depressive symptoms. So I'm not surprised that that link is there. Games that kind of had mixed results that we'll get into are action games. They looked at a game called Boson X, and I'll get into that in a minute as well. So in terms of the Sparks game, I think it's pretty cool. So this is another game developed with cognitive behavioral therapy elements. And I think you can still get this. Like I know people can still access this game, even though it was developed by a group of researchers. So in this game, there's like 7 modules, there's like 7 levels. And across these 7 levels, you fight enemies that they call gnats, which I think that's a cute name. Gloomy, negative, automatic thoughts. That's what it stands for. So I thought that was a cute idea. And it's kind of cool that this is like a more fantasy RPG kind of game. I thought that was neat. And throughout these 7 modules or levels, they introduce and educate the players on different techniques for managing depression. So relaxation and breathing exercises, improving your interpersonal skills, teaching you how to deal with emotions, distress tolerance, which is like a big part of like DBT and CBT therapy. That means not just coping with your emotions, but feeling your negative emotions and getting used to feeling them so you don't completely retreat. So it's kind of like exposure therapy in that way with negative emotions. And then cognitive restructuring, so changing the way you perceive or look at a situation in a more positive light. And they tested this with 187 adolescents, which is pretty impressive. That's a good N size with clinical depression. 94 played the game. 93 just received standard therapy. And they found that the game did indeed reduce depression, anxiety, and feelings of hopelessness. So this game seems to be working pretty well. I know researchers are still working with it, and they still see some value in it to this day, even though this was made back in like 2012, which is pretty cool. Now the Boson X game, this is really interesting. So this is the study that had mixed results. This is 50 participants with clinical depression. They spent 6 weeks playing Boson X. This was an action game. Or a waitlist control group, meaning a waitlist control group means they didn't do anything those 6 weeks, but after the 6 weeks were over, then they could play the game for 6 weeks. So they just had to wait their turn, and they compared them as a control group in the 6 weeks. They weren't doing anything. So they found that playing Boson X had no effect on depression severity. no effect on depression emotions or those kind of symptoms. But they had lower rumination scores specifically. So it didn't really help with their emotions or their feelings about the depression, but it did decrease their rumination only, which is really interesting. So that's why action games kind of have mixed results with depression. It's called, it's part of like the part of the brain they call executive functioning in your prefrontal cortex. That's the part that allows you to plan and make decisions. And it actually does play a really important role in balancing your limbic system, where a lot of your depression and anxiety is coming from. So if you could strengthen that prefrontal cortex area, you can actually not get rid of your depression and anxiety or your emotions, but you can manage them better. So there is a potential for these action games to help you manage that part of your depression and anxiety, even if not the emotion part. So I thought that was really interesting. So that could be kind of a benefit of action games that hasn't been looked at as much for just helping with that part. Yes, in the back.
So for Bullseye,
Uh-huh.
is that used in treating ADHD?
Was it used in treating ADHD?
Yeah.
I don't know if it has been. In that study, it was used for depression specifically.
Because I heard ADHD can also be called adaptive function, something. Anyway, we're just interested about that. Because I think it's common.
Yeah. Executive functioning is definitely related to attention and ADHD, and like there's a lot of training in that. And there are companies that do develop games specifically for ADHD. Actually, one is called Akili, so that's AKILI. Unfortunately, that game is not commercially available. It's through prescription only, which, I mean, there's different models to approach this games and health situation. Some companies decide to go with the prescription model, like they want to partner with doctors and make it prescription only. I personally disagree with that model. Personally, I think it's better just to make it commercially available so people can buy it, and then you can partner with doctors and therapists to use it. I'm not sure why you need them as like a gatekeeper to access the game like that. So at Deepwell, the company I'm working with, we're not doing that prescription model. We are definitely doing the give it to everybody model and then work with like partners afterwards. So that's just my 2 cents. Other people feel differently, I'm sure. Yes.
So, you just touched on prescription video games.
Yeah.
How widely accepted is that? Like, and do you know what games can be treated for that? Like, you have, like, is it widely known when your doctor's like, play this video game? You have to because it will help your X disease.
So the situation with prescription video games right now is like cutting edge, brand new. Like Akili is, I think, one of the first companies to try that model, like ever. And so we're seeing how that turns out and how helpful that actually is. I'm not sure it's as helpful personally, especially with the rate that games change and the technology evolves. Like the amount of time it'll take for you to build those partnerships and get that prescription access, you're going to be on a new console generation by then. You know, so there's limitations to that model that we're seeing. So it was a thing that was worth trying, but I just think with the speed of the technology, I don't think it's going to be useful in the long run personally. But we'll see. I could be proven wrong. Yeah.
Just want to say, as a healthcare provider, I completely agree with you. It's the amount of red tape and hurdles and training and just, you know, it's hard enough to get a hospital to adopt technology that makes sense to them, like beds that can turn patients on their own.
Yeah.
Let alone invest in video games.
Yeah.
And just, you know, training with archaic medical professionals that, were trained 30 years ago for video games or even considering a mainstream thing, getting them to prescribe video games, that's going to be hard. There's a huge problem in healthcare, especially in mental health care, where we're seeing a departure from even things like providing cognitive behavioral therapy, which are evidence-based and established, but we don't have the workforce basically to provide that for the amount of people that need it. So accessibility is a huge issue, and I just want to say thank you for not going to prescription route, because it doesn't ever help.
You're welcome. We really don't want to go the prescription route. There's so much red tape, and I think the prescription route is important when you're dealing with medication that could have side effects.
Right, absolutely.
But like a game, that's a different situation. Yes, there is a chance of certain side effects, like certain people do get addicted to games, like that's a real thing. But it's nothing like some medications that will increase your suicidal ideation. Like, it's just a totally different level there. And so I think it's better to make them accessible.
Unknown is what it is.
Yeah.
Fear. But
Yeah.
if you think about, we really don't know how SSRIs work still, and we've been prescribing them today.
It's true, unfortunately, we don't know how SRIs work still.
Hopefully, more open-minded folks join the profession in the future.
Yeah, I hope so. So I'll take one more comment, and then I'll move on to the next section.
My question in general is just whether depression, anxiety, do you see across the studies like most positive outcomes at a certain, I'd say, degree? So for example, someone who's moderately or mildly depressed is going to have like the most likelihood to benefit from, video games, where someone who's severely or who has severe depression might not see as much return.
That's something I'd like to test, so to see if the effects are different versus if you have like mild, moderate, or severe anxiety or depression. So I think we know that it does help mild and moderate. When we do our clinical study of the game that we're developing, once it's ready, I'd like to, if we do get people with more severe anxiety, I'd like to see if it helps them also. So I don't know the answer to that yet, but I'm going to find out. So PTSD and trauma. I just want to share this really cool study about Tetris that we found last year. Really cool. So in a hospital, they recruited 71 participants who literally just came from a motor vehicle accident, within 6 hours. They just came from a motor vehicle accident. They just got admitted to the hospital. They either were in the accident or they witnessed it, and they do an inventory to see if you have short-term trauma about it, and they did. And they actually saw if playing Tetris could basically decrease their risk for PTSD. It was really cool. So within 6 hours after the accident and being in the hospital, they did a study where they showed 37 of these 71 people a reminder of the accident to prime them, whether it's describing the accident or showing a picture. And then they had them play Tetris just for 10 minutes, just 10 minutes. And they found a week after the accident, the Tetris players had fewer intrusive memories about the event. Amazing. Good job, Tetris. It's so cool. So it shows this is brand new cutting edge stuff. So there's not a lot of this out there right now, but it shows you could use something like Tetris to maybe decrease risk of somebody developing PTSD, essentially. If you can get it in this sensitive window and have them distracted in this sensitive window of these 6 hours, you might be able to decrease that risk, which is super cool and amazing. I just thought this was the coolest thing. The other slide I have about PTSD, so we know that the games will decrease the stress part of PTSD, like we talked about earlier with anxiety and stress. That's part of PTSD also. But when it comes to PTSD, we're going to talk specifically about like, there's like the argument, there's like two camps, especially when you're looking at like veterans, you know, at playing shooting or military games. There's like camp one that's like, well, it could be helpful for exposure and these things, but there's camp two that's like, well, it could also trigger traumatic memories because they're reliving these events, right? So it's really mixed and complicated, and I don't have an answer. I could just show you just what the different results are so far. So some studies have shown that games, if veterans play these games, it can help with their well-being and confidence and socialization, especially since they have more confidence in their military strategy. They actually find some benefit in going back to those scenarios. But they can also trigger traumatic memories as well in these self-reports. But we've also seen studies that show that playing these type of games had no effect on PTSD symptoms, like they were either there or not there already, and the games didn't seem to improve or worsen them, so we've seen that. But we've also seen in specifically therapeutic environments, games like this have been used as exposure therapy to improve PTSD and have. So they'll use like, some researchers created like a virtual reality Iraq and Afghanistan scenario to get veterans to cope with some of their challenges when they were dealing with that. So there's really no answer. I guess it probably depends on the person, probably. Like some people it probably helps, some people it probably makes it worse for them. And definitely if it's going to be used therapeutically, I would suggest for right now being monitored like in a study or with a professional for the exposure therapy. That just seems best because you just don't know how an individual is going to react. Yes?
Is there any difference, or have they looked at like the realism of the game or, you know, like what the setting of the game is? Because there are definitely, you know, first-person shooters that are 20 years old that might not have the same effect. You know what I'm saying? Like the realism or the if it's historical versus, you know, a sci-fi action shooter game.
I haven't heard of a study like that. I know in these studies with exposure, they tend to look at more realistic games because they want to see that effect. So they tend to look at more realistic military scenarios like Call of Duty, you know, modern warfare, things like that. That's what they tend to look at to see if that effect is there.
I mean, it does at least say that they're using a VR virtual reality, so it's meant to be as realistic as possible.
Exactly.
So at least in that situation, it seems to have come better. So the more realistic, possibly, the more helpful.
Yeah, they try to make it as realistic. But with exposure therapy, they also try to program baby steps. So they're not like thrown in at once. It's like, you know, first might be like driving down the street and like virtual Iraq and seeing how they react. And then, you know, something bigger will happen that they have to deal with, and then something bigger. So there's like steps. So they try to make the environment around them as realistic as possible, but the scenarios, they up them in terms of seriousness, you know, as they go through the treatment. Okay, so I think I only have like 10 minutes left. And then also games, I just didn't have time. There's just like so much I could do in just an hour. We also know that people have created games these are groups who created games specifically to help with ADHD, autism, eating disorders, and specific phobias through exposure therapy, like especially like fear of flying on airplanes. That's a big one. Fear of heights is another one. So they exist, they're definitely out there. They're not commercially available. These tend to be made by researchers specifically to train or help with something like exposure therapy, or with autism doing like social training in terms of interpersonal effectiveness, how do you work with people, things like that. But getting to my conclusions, if you ever need to convince somebody why to use video games for these things, like in your profession or with your friends, here are some things that could help. First of all, I think that these games should be used alongside medication and therapy. I by no means think they're a replacement for these things. Once again, going back to that biopsychosocial model, it's so complicated that we kind of need to use everything we have at our disposal to treat these things. So I definitely don't want to rule anything out. But the reason why this can be helpful in addition to those things is we see that overall games have higher adherence rates than therapy and medication. So people are going to go through with it because they're fun and stuff. So I mean, like, therapy non-adherence rates can be up to like 66%. It can be really high. Like, even if like the therapist is great and amazing, sometimes people still can't show up to the therapy. So just having something that can help, that they can adhere to, is something that's worth it, and that's what games can do. And there's reasons why that the adherence rate is better, First of all, it's like more convenient just to play at home. You don't have to like go to an office, and if you're severely depressed, that can be really hard to do. It's accessible. It's pretty affordable in the grand scheme of things, especially compared to some, medication and therapy can be really expensive. You don't have side effects like you do with medication. You get continuous feedback in real time, like you see how you're doing as you're playing the game. You don't have to wait for results. And we find that even when people know a game's like healthy for them, they still play it anyway. It doesn't seem to detract from their willingness to play it. And games are fun, and that's what makes it easier to adhere to as well. So it's something that could just be another tool in the toolbox for somebody to have or for a therapist to recommend. And I wanted to just go over overall at the very end here, kind of what the mechanisms are putting all of this together. Why are these games helping? Why do we think they're working this way? And there are a lot of theories about that. So first is this, what we call a flow state, which is this sense of engagement, this state of engagement with the game. This is like a really amazing founding principle created by a psychologist with the longest name ever. I actually looked at videos how to pronounce it. So I think it's Csikszentmihalyi. I think that's how you pronounce it. And he created the flow state theory and how having full engagement in a task will distract you from your anxious thoughts and emotions. Having that full engagement. And potentially if you're able to get into that fully engaged state with this task, maybe you could have better focus in other tasks as well. And this is why we were saying earlier, like a game has to work. It has to be fun and engaging for this mechanism to work. If it sucks or if it's not designed well, none of these benefits are going to happen. So focusing on making your game fun and engaging definitely should be number one on your list. You can also incorporate cognitive behavioral therapy elements like exposure or managing thoughts and cognitive restructuring emotions. Just be sure it's intentional. So that's why I kind of recommend this a little bit more for these games that are specifically made for that by researchers. Like that, it's more important to have their say-so, I think, if you're going that direction in making a game. But it can be helpful to have these elements in there. Exercise is a big one. We saw with the extra games and depression. Having people release endorphins and hormones during exercise can reduce your stress, anxiety, and depression, and you can have fun while you're doing it. Executive functioning improvement, we were talking about this with the rumination earlier. So depression and anxiety tend to have executive dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex. It's harder for them to plan and make decisions. So even having games that are able to build up your executive functioning can be good. And we find these typically in shooter action games. Relaxation is a big factor. Activating your parasympathetic nervous system, decreasing your heart rate and your stress can certainly improve your positive emotions, your well-being, and give you some psychological detachment from the stresses of your daily life. Games also provide uniquely what's called mastery experiences. So by having more control and overcoming these challenges that these games present, you increase your self-efficacy, you increase your confidence to kind of get through the day. And that's why having these challenges in games is like such a critical element, as well as being fun and engaging. And then lastly, there's socialization. So doing activities with friends and peers can improve your mood, decrease your depression, anxiety, and loneliness. Only if the gaming environment is positive, though. Like, we also know there are gaming environments out there that are not this way. So I would say, like, any social interaction is good. If it's a healthy social interaction, then it's good. So that would be my statement there. So kind of what do we make of all this? We definitely know games can help stress, anxiety, depression, and trauma. We know that no single game has all the benefits. And so kind of my recommendation is to play a wide range of games to get these benefits. Play games that are good for your individual situation, your individual tastes and preferences. And discontinue playing any games that worsen your symptoms. So if, like in that study, World of Warcraft just makes you feel awful, then don't play that. For some people, it might make them feel really great. So it just depends on your situation. And then, have fun, because, that fun and engagement and flow state is like such a huge part of the therapeutic benefit. So just lean all the way into the fun. And then lastly, feel free to support developers and organization events that promote healthy games. So here's a list of like some events and conferences. So Games for Good, Serious Play, Games for Change, Meaningful Play. These are all events that really showcase these games. Take This is a really great organization. I've personally worked with a couple of the psychologists and social scientists that are on the board. I don't know if you call it. But Rachel Cowart and Kelly Dunlap, they're really great researchers. They do a lot in terms of advertising for healthy gaming. I love working with them. And then, of course, Deepwell is the company I'm working with right now. We're trying to make more healthy games. We're just starting with our first game, and making a game takes a long time, so we still have a lot of work to do before we're really ready to show that to everybody. But I'm hoping, if things go well, we can bring it next MAGFest, so we can actually have people like try it out. That'd be so cool. So that's kind of like everything. Thank you for coming today. Yeah, you're welcome to take a picture of my contact information if you have any questions, like take any pictures of these slides, or if you want to request that I send these slides to you in a PDF, I can absolutely do all of that. In the jacket. Yes, you.
Out of
Yes.
curiosity, what's the game called? Are we allowed to ask?
I don't know how much I'm allowed to say yet. This is my first time, I can say it's a virtual reality game, and it's a rhythm and action game. So, and we're trying to incorporate some cool new elements to kind of give it that more relaxing feel. So I'm pretty excited. I've been play testing it, and I'm pretty psyched with how it's turning out.
Sounds dope.
Yeah.
Are there any studies that look at the effects of games as compared to just having a regular recommended like entertainment? So like to maybe see the strengths and weaknesses of games versus other forms of entertainment, or maybe see what the effects are that are maybe not attached to just like making sure a person's actively engaging in like entertainment media.
Okay. They were asking if people have done like a control group where you've compared playing a game to other forms of entertainment. I know in the past, especially with my work on like pain perception and like reducing pain while playing games, that you would often compare it to like an active engagement media, like a game versus like a passive engagement, like watching a movie. And we definitely find the game has more benefits than like anything that's passive. So it's that really active, engaging element that, is bringing the magic with the game. So games we do find are having a stronger effect than just watching a movie, because it's very passive as an activity. Not that there can be benefits, especially if a movie has like a message about mental health or like a story about it that really resonates with you. Like there can be benefits, but in terms of the benefits we're seeing here, like games really are more effective because they're engaging, because you get to play with them. All right, one more and we gotta wrap it up.
One last question with regards to all of the multiplayer games. Was there anything done to control for whether it was the multiplayer game or just it being a social activity that you're doing with other people?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know if anybody's looked at that, so I'd have to look into that. I actually don't know the answer to that, which is exciting. I like not knowing the answer to things because then I get to do more research about things. All right, well, thank you so much for coming. I hope this was helpful.